In October 2016, during my sophomore year at a small liberal arts college in upstate New York, I was assigned a single dorm room on the third floor of Langley Hall. It was the oldest residence building on campus, built sometime in the 1920s, and it had this Gothic architecture that always made it feel like it belonged in another era. While others found it charming, I felt uneasy the second I stepped inside. The hallways echoed even when no one was around. You could hear whispers in the plumbing, and the lights flickered, not constantly, but enough to notice. I chalked it up to old wiring. I moved into room 313, which was at the far end of the third-floor corridor. The room was small but cozy. Nothing unusual at first glance, but I soon noticed that my door would never fully close on its own, like it resisted latching even when I yanked it hard. My RA said the entire building had settled weirdly, so most of the doors were like that. Still, it felt like room 313 resisted being shut in a way that wasn't structural. It felt deliberate. The first real incident happened about a week into the semester. I was up late working on a paper and dozing off at my desk. At around 3 a.m. I woke up to find my laptop closed. Not off, just closed. I was alone in the room and I hadn't touched it. When I opened it, the screen had gone black and wouldn't turn on. I had to do a hard restart. The strangest part was that all my work was gone. Every single file on my desktop was deleted. I assumed maybe there was some system crash, but my friend studying computer science later told me it looked more like a manual deletion. I was more annoyed than scared, but then came the dreams. Every single night, without fail, I dreamt of a girl with wet, stringy black hair who sat in the corner of my room, facing away from me. I could never see her face. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced someone had been in the room, but it was always empty. I tried switching up my sleeping schedule, even slept with the lights on for a few days. The dreams didn't stop. I didn't tell anyone about the dreams until one weekend when my friend Megan stayed over after a late night of studying. She crashed on my bed while I worked at my desk. At around 2:30 a.m., she shot upright and asked if I had a sister. Confused, I said no. She told me she woke up because she thought someone was sitting at the edge of the bed, brushing her hair. When she turned over, no one was there, but the edge of the bed was indented, like someone had just gotten up. I didn't sleep much after that. A few days later, I noticed something scratched into the wood beneath my mattress while I was changing my sheets. It wasn't visible unless you lifted the mattress completely. It read, "She hides behind the door." The letters were jagged and deep, like they'd been etched with something sharp. I reported it to my RA, who was clearly unsettled, but said there was no record of any incidents in the room's recent history. She promised to escalate it to housing, but nothing ever came of it. At this point, I started sleeping in the library or crashing in friends' dorms. I couldn't take it anymore, but I had to go back to grab some of my stuff. One afternoon, around 4 p.m., I returned to room 313. I kept the door wide open, the hallway light streaming in. As I packed, I heard something whisper, faint, but right behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. Then I saw it. The closet door, which I never used, was slightly ajar, and something inside shifted. It wasn't loud, just the subtle sound of something brushing against fabric. I stood frozen, unsure whether to run or open it. Against every instinct I had, I walked toward the closet and yanked the door open. It was empty, completely empty. Except for one thing. There, hanging from the coat hook, was a name tag. It was old, worn, with a faded photo of a girl. Dark hair, wide eyes, and under the name field it said, Resident Assistant 1996. Her name was Rebecca. I had never seen her on campus. I showed it to campus security. They took it seriously enough to investigate, and eventually found that a student named Rebecca L. had taken her life in Langley Hall in 1996, in room 313. She had been an RA who reportedly began exhibiting signs of paranoia, complaining about someone in the closet, and eventually stopped attending classes. No one checked on her until it was too late. They found her hanging from the closet hook. The story had been buried out of respect, they said. Most students didn't know about it. The university never used her name when discussing mental health awareness, but they quietly stopped assigning room 313 after that semester. I never stayed another night in that room. And every now and then I'll wake up at 3 a.m., convinced I can hear whispering, as if she's still trying to reach out, trapped in a room no one wants to remember. It was late September 2019, and I had just transferred to a university in rural Oregon. Because I enrolled mid-semester, housing was limited, and I was placed in a small dorm usually reserved for graduate students. The building itself was tucked away at the edge of campus, surrounded by dense trees that cast long shadows even in the middle of the day. The hallways were dimly lit, with peeling paint and narrow windows that barely let in light. They gave me room 2B, an oddly placed room at the end of a corner hallway, close to the emergency staircase that nobody seemed to use. When I moved in, the room felt colder than the hallway, even with the radiator on. It had this stale, unmoved air that clung to your clothes. The ceiling above the bed had a patchy water stain in the shape of something vaguely human. I remember laughing it off as a weird coincidence, but nothing about 2B was coincidental. The first thing I noticed was the tapping, but it wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It came from beneath the bed. Slow, deliberate taps, always in threes. I dismissed it at first, told myself it was old pipes or settling wood, but every night, around 2:47 a.m., the tapping returned. Tap, 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 the same rhythm, always from under the bed. I even looked one night, fully expecting to find maybe a loose heat pipe or a draft playing tricks on me. Nothing, just an untouched floor and dust that looked undisturbed for years. A few nights later, I woke up with a nosebleed. I'd never had one before. It wasn't a trickle either. It stained my pillow and pooled slightly on the sheets. I got up to clean myself in the sink, and when I glanced at the mirror, I froze. Behind me, barely visible, was a silhouette sitting on the bed, completely still. I whipped around. Nothing. The bed was empty. But my pillow, the one with the blood, was flipped over. I started sleeping with the lights on. I told my dorm advisor, who kindly offered to check for mold or carbon monoxide, but everything came back normal. He even joked that I must be getting spooked by midterm stress. I smiled, but I knew it wasn't stress. Something in that room was watching me. I tried sleeping with headphones in, playing white noise just to block out the tapping. It worked for a night or two, but then came the whispering, barely audible, as if someone was trying to speak from inside the wall right behind my bed. It was always the same voice, but muffled, raspy, wet. Sometimes I'd catch a word, stay, or cold. Once I swear I heard it say my name. One night I stayed at the library until it closed and forced myself to pull an all-nighter on campus just to avoid sleeping in that room. When I came back around 6 a.m., my door was slightly open. I hadn't left it that way. When I stepped in, everything looked normal, except all of the drawers in my desk had been pulled open and flipped upside down. My clothes were still there. Nothing was stolen. But in the middle of the floor, directly under the water stain on the ceiling, was my toothbrush, standing perfectly upright, balanced. That same morning, my neighbor, a quiet grad student named Elias, caught me in the hallway and asked, kind of cautiously, "You're in 2B, right?" I nodded. He hesitated, then said, "Just don't let it in." I laughed it off, assuming he meant bugs or whatever, but his face didn't change. I asked what he meant, but he just mumbled something and walked off. The next day, I knocked on his door, no answer. By the third day, campus police were at his door. He hadn't been seen or heard from. Eventually, they found him off campus, incoherent and wandering near the river. He'd apparently dropped out. I never saw him again. I started doing research on the building. There wasn't much online, just vague mentions of renovations and structural complaints, but buried in an archived newsletter from 2007, I found a passing reference to a fire that happened on the second floor. Room 2B had suffered the most damage. A student had supposedly died during the evacuation, trapped under fallen ceiling plaster. The article didn't mention her name, just that her body wasn't found until the next morning. She had died alone while everyone else escaped. That night I didn't sleep. I laid on my bed, lights on, staring at the ceiling. And at 2:47 a.m., the tapping started again. This time it was louder, faster, as if someone beneath the bed was desperate. I didn't dare move. I just stared upward. The water stain looked darker than usual, thicker, and then right in front of my eyes, something dripped from it, onto my forehead, cold, sticky. I screamed and bolted out of the room. The RA came, half awake and confused. We went back inside together, but the stain was gone, the ceiling was clean, dry, my pillow was dry. The RA looked at me like I'd hallucinated the whole thing. I transferred rooms the next day, moved into another dorm across campus. I never returned to 2B. Months later, I ran into the old RA again. He asked, half joking, "Did your new room come with any ghosts?" I asked him seriously this time if he knew anything about 2B. His face changed. Quietly, he said, They were supposed to seal that room. Don't know why they reopened it. To this day, I still wake up at 2:47 a.m. once in a while, no matter where I am, and I swear sometimes I can still hear the faint sound of tapping, 3 slow taps from underneath. In October 2019, I transferred to a small liberal arts college in Vermont and moved into one of the older dorm buildings on campus. It was a red brick structure surrounded by tall trees, and during the day it looked charming in an eerie New England way, but inside the place showed its age: creaky wooden floors, flickering lights, and vents that let every sound travel like a whisper across rooms. I moved into room 212, a corner unit with a view of the woods and a rusted vent directly above my bed. From the moment I got there, I had a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. My roommate had dropped out a week before I arrived, so I had the place to myself, or at least that's what I thought. It started with noises, faint scratching from the vent. At first I assumed it was squirrels or maybe birds nesting somewhere in the ducts, but then things escalated. One night, while reading under my blanket with a flashlight, I heard the softest crinkling sound, like paper being folded. I looked up and saw nothing, but the noise repeated for several minutes. The next morning I climbed up on the desk to peer into the vent. There was something wedged inside. I grabbed a coat hanger and pulled it out, a small crumpled note on yellowed paper. It read in shaky handwriting, "It's watching me when I sleep." I laughed nervously and told myself it had to be a joke. Maybe a student from years ago left it as some kind of creepy dorm tradition. But that didn't explain the noise. The crinkling kept happening, always around 3:17 a.m., like clockwork. It became a routine. I'd wake up, hear the noise, stare at the vent, and wait for it to stop. One night I fell asleep with my phone recording, hoping to catch the sound. The next morning, I played it back. For the first few minutes, there was only the creak of the building settling. Then, right at 3:17 a.m., a whisper, soft, deliberate, and slow. "He knows you read it." I dropped my phone. I checked every logical explanation I could think of. Pipes, radio interference, anything. But it was a whisper, clear as day, and it was answering the note I'd found. That night, I went back into the vent. I pulled out another piece of paper, this one newer, cleaner. This one said, "Tell no one," or "He comes next." I stopped sleeping in that room after that. I started crashing in friends' dorms, coming back only during the day to grab my things. One day, I ran into a janitor, an older guy with a thick Boston accent. I told him my vent was acting up, trying to sound casual. He went quiet. Then he asked what room I was in. When I said 212, he looked up from his mop and nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "Girl in 97 started hearing things. Then a guy in 03, they all switched rooms. None of them stayed past midterms." I asked him what was in the vent. He said no one really knew. Maintenance had never found animals, no sign of a break-in. But each time someone moved out, the vent had paper inside, pages torn from notebooks, some old, some recent. All with different handwriting. All with warnings. Of course, I had to know more. I broke dorm policy and snuck into the basement one night where old student records were kept. I found files on the 2 students the janitor mentioned. Both had dropped out suddenly. One had cited mental health issues, the other simply disappeared, withdrawal papers unsigned. But there was a third file, one I hadn't expected. It was for a resident assistant from 1985, assigned to the same room. She'd been reported missing after finals week. The investigation said she left town, but her final note in the file stopped me cold. It was a scanned photocopy of a sticky note left in her room. It said, "Don't read the papers, they aren't from me." I moved out the next morning. I told the housing office it was a personal emergency. I never went back to 212, not even to collect my last box, but 2 weeks later I got a text from the new student who moved in. I didn't even know how they got my number. It simply said, "Is this your handwriting?" Attached was a photo of a crumpled note. My handwriting, unmistakable. It read, "He comes at 3:17. To this day, I don't know how that note got there. I burned every piece of paper I owned from that dorm. I changed my number. I even moved out of state after graduation. But every now and then, I still wake up at 3:17 a.m., and for a split second I swear I hear paper rustling and a whisper asking, "Did you tell anyone?" If these stories made you glance over your shoulder or question the shadows in your room, you're not alone. Reality blurs in the dark, and some things refuse to stay buried. For more real horror like this, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chilling tale.